In this video, we're going to clarify the terms signs, symbols, and archetypes, and then we're going to talk about Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, and his view of the collective unconscious, also called dream theory. In your notes, I want you to think about the three qualities of Carl Jung's description of an archetype, understand the origin of an archetype. And so sometimes in the way that we describe things, it's important to show what something is not. So an archetype is not X, but it is this. And then list some of the archetypes that Jung found through his dream theory, which he called the collective unconscious. To the left, you see Buddhist monks creating a mandala. It's also called mandala. I looked up the pronunciation, and it depends on where you are, how you say it. But it's an interesting visualization of an archetype. You might spend some time with this. It's really a fascinating artistic form. Okay, in literature, we often talk about signs, symbols, and archetypes. So a sign is an indicator of a pattern. It may represent a bigger idea. So pay attention to the signs, for they can often become a symbol or a motif. Symbols are signs which rise to the level of symbols when they are repeated often and come to symbolize more than their physical features. So the first sign that we have is the conch. Ralph and Piggy find the conch shell, they blow the shell, and all the kids come running. Then later, as the story progresses, the conch comes to symbolize the meeting, and no one can speak unless they possess the conch shell. And then in the very end of the book, when the conch shell shatters into a million pieces, it symbolizes the shattering of the civilization. They've really become the barbarians that they're starting to resemble physically. So the conch shell is definitely a sign. Okay, they pick it up and they use it. It's a sign of something. We start to see it repeated, but as it adapts and it changes, it takes on more of a symbolic level, a symbolic nature. Same thing happens with the fire. So in the beginning, the fire is simply a fire. It is. But it also comes to symbolize much more. It comes to symbolize safety. It comes to symbolize rescue. It also comes to symbolize destruction. And it nearly wipes out the entire island. Their face painting is also symbolic. They begin to do it at the beginning simply as a random action. But by the end of the book, it has happened multiple times, and it takes on additional new meaning. So what's an archetype? Well, an archetype is a symbol, and a symbol rises to the level of archetype when it can transcend culture, gender, socioeconomic status. They are innate, universal, and hereditary. So does fire represent the same thing cross-culturally? Can a fire represent safety? Can a fire represent hope? Can a fire represent destruction? And the answer to that is probably yes. So it can be archetypal in the way that it is represented. Your homework has two parts. Number one, I want you to pay attention to Carl Jung and what he talked about in his theories, but I also want you just to go get a penny. And I want you to divide your paper into two columns. And in the left-hand column, I want you to list all the things that you see about that penny. Everything on it, even the smallest detail. And then I want you to go back through in that first column, and I want you to circle the things that you think might be symbolic. They represent more than just their literal meaning. Then when you're done with that, I want you to go and on the right-hand side, choose those symbols which you think may transcend into archetypes. For instance, the circular shape of the penny. That in and of itself, that circle represents more than just a circle culturally. A circle is often a universal symbol for life, for renewal. So let's talk about Carl Jung. Who was he? Well, anyone who studies psychology or psychiatry will learn about Carl Jung. So I first learned about him in my high school psychology class. I studied him again in college. But it wasn't until I began really teaching literature that I realized how his story and his research really connects with what Joseph Campbell was studying and researching at the same time. Two different fields, but yet they were talking about very similar things. He was born in 1875 and lived till 1960. Think about all the things that he saw and he experienced in that time. When Carl Jung first began, psychology and psychiatry were just in their infancy as fields of study. And so the theories were just beginning to be written down, discussed, and researched. Carl Jung was a student of the famous Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud is often called the father of psychology, the father of psychiatry. And he began research into our unconscious. He believed that many of the actions that people have are motivated not by their conscious mind, but by their unconscious mind. And he's famous for attributing many of our negative qualities to sexual impulses. And you can do a little bit more study on that if you want to. Both Freud and Jung explored the unconscious mind, but Jung began to break away from some of Freud's theories that all of our motivations were sexual in nature, and he began to look at other causes for certain behaviors, often behaviors that we wanted to control. And he began to specialize in helping patients understand their dream state. Based on his work with thousands of patients, he concluded that we are all born with a set of unconscious patterns of behavior that psychologists call archetypes. We may not be aware when an archetype is influencing the ways, good or bad, we relate to significant people in our lives. He coined a phrase called the collective unconscious, and it was really fascinating when he began to interview all of these patients and ask them about their dreams, kind of delve into their unconscious state and look at some of their motivations, and he began to see these patterns that emerged. And it didn't matter who the person was. They transcended gender, they transcended age, they transcended culture, they transcended social economic status. Within the people that he interviewed, there were these patterns of behavior, these patterns of dreams. And so he began to theorize that somehow human beings are connected in a way that we may not even recognize. So he identified a number of archetypes, and you can really go more into detail with this if you want to. One that he talks about is the self. The self is an archetype that represents the unification of the unconscious and the consciousness of an individual. The creation of the self occurs through a process known as individuation, in which the various aspects of personality are integrated. Jung often represented the self as a circle, a square, or a mandala. One of my favorite archetypes is what he called the shadow. And the shadow is composed of repressed ideas, weaknesses, desires, instincts, and shortcomings, often described as the darker side of the psyche, representing wildness, chaos, and the unknown. These latent dispositions, and latent means that they're there, but they haven't yet come to fruition. They're hidden. They haven't been exposed yet. That these latent dispositions are present in all of us, Jung believed, although people sometimes deny this element of their own psyche and instead project it onto others. Shadows can appear in dreams or visions, and they may take a variety of forms. It might appear as a snake, a monster, a demon, a dragon, or some other dark, wild, or exotic figure. How do those same images start to play out in Joseph Campbell's stories? Persona. The persona is how we represent ourselves to the world. Persona derived from a Latin word that literally means mask. It represents all of the different social masks that we wear among different groups and situations. And the persona acts to shield the ego from negative images. So some of Carl Jung's other archetypes include the trickster, the divine child, the innocent, the mother or the father figure, the lover, the ruler. And it's fascinating to me that at the same time that Joseph Campbell is studying world literature and finding these patterns that transcend culture, gender, socioeconomic status, Carl Jung is finding the same stories or similar stories, similar patterns with his patients as he interviews them about their dreams. So think about those kinds of things as we go forward. And you don't have to be able to list in detail all the elements that I shared with you about Carl Jung's theories. Be able to describe an archetype, talk about who Carl Jung was, talk about the collective unconscious and what that is, and some of the general archetypes. Be able to describe them in general. This isn't a psychology course. I don't expect you to have all the details. If you have some questions, come to class with them. This is the place that we'll unpack and we'll discuss. See you next class.